Most people spend about 40 years working toward the exact same goal. One day, they'll stop. Stop working. Stop commuting. Stop answering emails. Stop waking up to an alarm clock. That's the promise behind retirement. Work hard now, save consistently, and eventually you reach the finish line where work disappears. But here's the strange part. When you actually look at the numbers behind modern retirement, the savings rates, the investment returns, the length of time people are living, something starts to feel a little off, because the math quietly suggests something most people never question. The goal we've been chasing for decades might be built on an assumption that no longer works. And once you see how the system actually functions, the idea of stopping work starts to look less like a financial milestone and more like a misunderstanding. Today, we're going to break down something most people never stop to question: the entire idea of retirement, where it came from, why it became the default life plan for millions of people, and why the original logic behind it may no longer match the world we live in today. We'll look at the math behind modern retirement, what it actually takes to stop working for decades, and why that goal creates a strange financial paradox for many people. And then we'll talk about a different way to think about this entirely. A framework where the goal isn't escaping work, but reaching a point where work becomes optional. Because once you see how this actually works, the entire goal of retirement starts to look different. My name is John, and I spend way too much time thinking about how people build wealth and plan for the future. If you're someone who's trying to save, invest, and figure out whether the traditional retirement path actually makes sense anymore, make sure to hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up if this helps you out. Now let's start with where the retirement idea actually came from. The idea of retirement feels so normal today that most people assume it has always existed. Work for a few decades, build up savings, and eventually step away from your career somewhere around your mid-60s. But historically, that model is actually very new. For most of human history, people didn't retire at all. Farmers, craftsmen, and small business owners usually worked in some capacity for most of their lives. Work simply changed as they got older. The intensity might drop, responsibilities might shift, but the idea of completely stopping work for 20 or 30 years wasn't really part of the economic system. The modern concept of retirement started to take shape in the early 20th century. One of the biggest turning points came in 1935, when the United States introduced Social Security. At the time, the government set the official retirement age at 65. That number wasn't random. Life expectancy in the United States in the mid-1930s was roughly around 61 years at birth. Even when you adjust for people who reached adulthood, the average person wasn't expected to spend decades in retirement. In other words, the system assumed something very specific. Many people would never collect benefits for very long, and the ones who did might receive them for only a handful of years. Now combine that with another major piece of the puzzle, the pension era. For much of the 20th century, large companies offered defined benefit pensions. If you stayed with the same employer for most of your career, the company promised to pay you a monthly income after you retired. This created a very clear life structure. You joined a company in your 20s or early 30s. You stayed there for 30 or 40 years, and then you retired with a pension plus Social Security. The system worked because several assumptions held true at the same time. People lived shorter lives. Companies carried the investment risk through pensions, and retirement typically lasted maybe 10 to 15 years. But fast forward to today, and many of those assumptions have quietly changed. People are living longer. Pensions have mostly disappeared, and retirement can easily last 25 or even 30 years. And this is where the entire system starts to show its cracks. For a while, that retirement system actually worked pretty well. A typical path looked something like this. You joined a company early in your career, stayed there for decades, and when you reached retirement age, you received a pension. That pension provided a predictable monthly income for the rest of your life, often combined with Social Security. The key detail is that the company carried most of the financial risk. They managed the investments. They guaranteed the payout, and employees simply had to stay long enough to qualify. This system also relied heavily on company loyalty. It wasn't unusual for someone to spend 30 or even 40 years with the same employer, and because retirement typically lasted a shorter period of time, the math was manageable. But over the past few decades, something quietly changed. Pensions began to disappear. Companies gradually shifted away from defined benefit plans and replaced them with defined contribution plans, most commonly the 401k. Instead of guaranteeing retirement income, employers began offering accounts where employees contribute their own money and invest it themselves. According to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, only a small percentage of private sector workers today have access to traditional pensions, while defined contribution plans, like 401ks, have become the dominant retirement vehicle. Today, Millions of Americans rely on these accounts. In fact, the Investment Company Institute estimates that over 70 million Americans participate in 401k plans, holding trillions of dollars in retirement savings. But the structure is completely different from the old system. Now the responsibility has shifted. Employees decide how much to save. Employees choose how to invest. Employees carry the market risk. At the same time, another trend has been moving in the opposite direction. People are living longer. Over the last century, life expectancy in the United States has increased dramatically. Many people who reach retirement age today can expect to live into their 80s or even 90s. That means retirement may last 2 or 3 decades. So we now have a system where individuals must fund their own retirement, manage their own investments, and stretch those savings across potentially 30 years without employment income. And here's the strange part. Most people are still following the same mental model that developed during the pension era. Work for decades, stop working completely, live off savings. But the structure supporting that plan has changed. People are trying to follow an old map in a completely different world. Here's what most people don't realize. When you run the numbers on modern retirement, the goal often isn't just saving enough to retire. The goal is saving enough to replace your entire income for decades. And that's where the definition of retirement starts to shift, because in many cases, it may no longer mean stopping work entirely. Now let's talk about the math behind retirement, because this is where things start to get a little uncomfortable. A common target people hear is the $1 million retirement goal. It shows up in articles, retirement calculators, and financial headlines all the time. But what does that number actually translate to in real life? One of the most widely discussed guidelines in retirement planning is something called the 4% rule. The idea is relatively simple. If you retire with a portfolio of investments, you withdraw about 4% of that portfolio each year, adjusted for inflation, and historically, the money has a reasonable chance of lasting around 30 years. So let's run the numbers. If you retire with $1 million and you withdraw 4% per year, that gives you about $40,000 per year before taxes. At first glance, that doesn't sound terrible. But now, let's add some context. According to the Federal Reserve's Survey of Consumer Finances, the median retirement savings for households approaching retirement is far below $1 million. In many cases, it's closer to a few $100,000, which means the typical retirement income generated from investments could be significantly lower than $40,000. Now compare that to spending. Data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics Consumer Expenditure Survey shows that the average household spends tens of thousands of dollars per year, often much more depending on location, healthcare costs, and housing. And this is where the math starts to feel tight. Because if the goal of retirement is to completely stop working, your savings must replace your entire income, not just for 5 years, not just for 10 years, but potentially for 25 or 30 years. And that leads to an important realization. Retirement isn't just about saving a large number. It's about creating a financial engine that can run for decades without new fuel. And this is where it gets really interesting, because the biggest variable in this entire equation isn't actually the stock market. It's time. Specifically, how long your retirement lasts. If someone retires at 65 and lives to 85, their savings must last about 20 years. But if someone lives to 95, that retirement suddenly becomes 30 years long. That's an extra decade of withdrawals, an extra decade of inflation, an extra decade where market downturns could happen. This is often referred to as longevity risk, the risk of simply living longer than your money lasts. And once you factor that into the equation, the traditional goal of retirement starts to look a little different, because the challenge isn't just accumulating wealth. The challenge is building a system where that wealth can support you for an unpredictable length of time. And for many people, that's where the idea of completely stopping work begins to run into some serious mathematical friction. But the retirement conversation isn't just about math. It's also about psychology, because the traditional retirement model creates a very specific mental timeline for life. First comes the working phase. You build your career, you work long hours, you delay certain things, you save aggressively. And the idea is that all of that effort leads to a future point where life finally opens up, where you have the time to travel, relax, explore hobbies, and enjoy the freedom you've been postponing. In other words, the system quietly encourages a mindset that looks like this: work now, life later. And on the surface, that sounds reasonable. But over decades, that structure can create a strange side effect. People begin to see their working years as something to endure, rather than something to design. The goal becomes escaping the job, escaping the schedule, escaping the routine. Retirement turns into a kind of finish line. And that leads to an interesting analogy. Imagine running a marathon where the only motivation is the moment you finally stop running. You're not focused on pacing, or enjoying the race, or building a sustainable rhythm. You're just waiting for the finish. But in real life, that finish line keeps moving. Life expectancy increases, healthcare costs shift, markets fluctuate, retirement timelines stretch. So what started as a 10-year finish line slowly becomes a 20-year one, and sometimes a 30-year one. And this is the dangerous assumption, the belief that the only solution is to completely stop working. Because when that becomes the goal, people often build careers and lifestyles they're trying to escape from. They tolerate jobs they dislike because the reward is supposed to arrive later. They postpone flexibility because the system promises freedom someday. But that structure has a flaw. If your entire life plan depends on eventually escaping work, then your working years become something you're simply trying to survive. And when you step back and look at it, that's a strange design, because work occupies most of your adult life. For many people, it's the largest block of time they'll ever spend doing anything. So designing your life around the idea that work must eventually disappear can lead to a deeper problem. You're optimizing for the moment when your life finally begins, instead of building a system where work and life actually fit together. And once you start looking at retirement through that lens, the goal itself starts to look different. Now let's pause for a moment and shift perspectives, because one of the biggest forces shaping retirement outcomes isn't income, and it isn't even investment returns. It's time. Let's look at what happens if you delay this. Imagine two people who both invest the exact same amount every month. Both of them invest $500 per month into a diversified portfolio, earning an average return of 8% per year. The difference is when they start. The first person starts investing at age 25 and continues for 30 years. The second person waits until age 35, but still invests the same $500 per month and earns the same return. On the surface, that delay doesn't seem dramatic. 10 years goes by quickly. Careers are developing. People are paying off student loans, buying homes, or just trying to stabilize financially. But now let's run the numbers. If you invest $500 per month for 30 years at 8%, you end up with roughly $745,000. But if you start 10 years later, investing the same $500 per month for 20 years, the total comes out closer to $295,000. That's a difference of roughly $450,000. And nothing about the investment strategy changed. Same monthly contribution, same market return, same portfolio. The only difference was time in the market. And here's what makes this example interesting. The person who started at 25 contributed about $180,000 over those 30 years. But the final portfolio is more than 4 times larger than the contributions. That extra growth didn't come from working harder. It came from compound growth doing the heavy lifting. This is why financial planning often feels counterintuitive. Most people assume wealth is primarily built through larger contributions later in life. But the math suggests something different. Early contributions, even relatively small ones, can have a disproportionate impact because they have more time to compound. Now watch what happens when we bring this back to retirement. If your strategy is built around stopping work completely at a fixed age, then every delay compresses the timeline where your investments can grow. You're asking the portfolio to do more work in less time. And that's where retirement planning starts to feel stressful, because the pressure shifts towards saving larger and larger amounts later. This changes how you look at retirement. The goal isn't just reaching a number by a certain age. The real leverage often comes from starting earlier and giving your money more time to work alongside you. Once you start looking at retirement through the lenses of math and psychology, a different framework begins to emerge. Instead of asking, when can I stop working? A more useful question might be, when does work become optional? That shift sounds subtle, but it completely changes the structure of the goal. Traditional retirement assumes a hard stop. You work for decades. You accumulate a large enough portfolio. And then one day, employment income disappears entirely. Financial independence works differently. Instead of trying to eliminate work, the goal is to reach a point where your investments and assets can cover your basic living expenses. At that moment, work becomes a choice rather than a requirement. You can continue working if you enjoy it. You can reduce your hours. You can switch careers. You can take breaks between projects. The key difference is control. Now, look at what that can mean in practice. Some people transition into consulting, using the expertise they've built over decades, but working on their own schedule. Others move into part-time roles that provide structure and social interaction without the pressure of a full-time career. Some people start passion projects, small businesses, creative work, or community involvement that may or may not generate income. And others simply design their work around flexibility, choosing when and how they contribute. In this model, income doesn't have to disappear completely. Instead, it becomes one piece of a larger financial system. Your investments provide a base layer of support. Part-time income fills the gap. And expenses can often decrease once the pressure of full-time employment disappears. Here's the part nobody talks about. Many people who retire actually return to work. not because they failed financially, but because they missed the structure, the sense of purpose, or the social interaction that work provides. In fact, studies consistently show that a significant number of retirees eventually take on some form of paid work again. But when they do, the experience is completely different. They're not working because they have to. They're working because they want to. And that distinction changes everything. Because once work becomes optional, it stops feeling like something you're trying to escape. It becomes something you can shape around the life you actually want to live. Now, you might be thinking, I don't want to work forever. And that's completely understandable. But there's an important distinction here. There's a big difference between working because you have to and working because you choose to. When work is required to pay the bills, it comes with pressure. You can't easily leave a job you dislike. You can't take long breaks. You can't redesign your schedule without risking your income. But when your investments cover most or all of your living expenses, the dynamic changes. You might still work, but now it's flexible. It's selective. It's optional. You can take projects that interest you and ignore the ones that don't. You can step away for months if you want. You can redesign your schedule in ways that simply aren't possible when every paycheck is necessary. And that shift from required work to optional work is often what people are actually looking for when they talk about retirement. Now, you might also be thinking, this only works for people who earn a lot of money. But financial independence isn't really about income alone. It's about structure. More specifically, it's about the relationship between spending, saving, and investing. Two people can earn the same salary and end up in completely different financial positions depending on how much of that income they keep and invest. Someone earning a moderate income who consistently saves and invests 20 to 30% of what they earn can build long-term financial flexibility. Meanwhile, someone earning a much higher salary but saving very little may remain financially dependent on their paycheck. So the goal isn't necessarily maximizing income. The goal is building a financial structure where assets gradually replace the need for constant labor. And once that structure is in place, the conversation shifts from how do I escape work to how do I design the life I want. So if the goal isn't simply stop working forever, what can you actually do about it? Here are a few practical steps that can help move you toward financial independence, where work becomes optional rather than mandatory. Step 1. Calculate your financial independence number. This is the portfolio size where your investments could reasonably support your lifestyle. A common shortcut is to estimate your annual spending and multiply it by about 25. This comes from the same logic behind the 4% withdrawal rule. So if you spend $50,000 per year, the rough financial independence target would be around $1.25 million. That number isn't meant to be perfect, but it gives you a clear target, which is far more useful than saving without direction. Step 2. Automate investing. One of the biggest mistakes people make is relying on motivation. Instead, treat investing like a fixed bill. Set up automatic transfers from your paycheck into retirement accounts or brokerage accounts. When the system runs automatically, you remove the constant decision-making that slows people down. Over long periods of time, consistency matters far more than timing. Step 3. Track your savings rate. Your savings rate, the percentage of income you invest, is one of the strongest predictors of how quickly you reach financial independence. For example, saving 10% of income leads to a very long timeline. Saving 20 to 30% dramatically shortens it. This is one of the few variables that people can actually control. Step 4. Design income flexibility. Financial independence doesn't have to mean replacing your entire salary with investments. Instead, think in layers. Investments might cover a portion of your expenses. A part-time role, consulting work, or a small side project could cover another portion. When income sources become flexible, the pressure on your investment portfolio decreases. Step 5. Reduce lifestyle inflation. As income increases, spending often rises just as quickly. But every permanent increase in lifestyle also raises the amount of money required to stop working. Keeping expenses relatively stable while income grows allows your investments to take on a larger role over time. And gradually, that's what moves you closer to a place where work becomes a choice rather than a necessity. So imagine two possible versions of the future. In the first one, retirement is a hard deadline. You work until a specific age because that's the number everyone uses. And when that day arrives, the decision to stop working isn't really flexible. It's driven by the size of your savings, the condition of your health, and whatever the markets happen to be doing at that moment. You're hoping the plan works. Now imagine a different scenario. Instead of waiting for a single retirement date, you gradually build a financial system that gives you options. Your investments cover a growing portion of your expenses. Your schedule becomes more flexible. You can scale work up or down depending on what you want your life to look like. The pressure slowly disappears because the goal was never really about escaping work. It was about reaching a point where your time is no longer controlled by your income. where work becomes something you can choose, shape, or even pause entirely. And once you reach that point, retirement stops being an escape plan and starts becoming something much more powerful. Freedom over how you spend your time. I'm curious how you think about this. What age do you currently expect to retire? And if you've ever run the numbers, what do you think your financial independence number might be? The point where work becomes optional? Comment below with either your expected retirement age or your FI goal. I read through the comments, and it's always interesting to see how different people approach this. My name is John, and I'm not a financial advisor. This video is for educational purposes only. Always do your own research and make financial decisions based on your individual situation.